Hi, everybody. It's time for tea with Megan. I am coming to you not live today as I had intended, but one of my dear friends who I haven't seen in months is going to come to my driveway today to have some social distance time. So my plan was to go live at 2, and in the future, that's going to be the plan, is to be live at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoons consistently so that you can join me in our conversations about books. But today we're going recorded, hopefully for the last time, so that I can make sure we wrap this book up as promised. So as we do every time, I'll start with just like, I don't know, a fact about me or something that might intrigue you. And anyone who knows me knows that I love literary pilgrimages. My blessed husband, whenever we travel anywhere, I find the literary sites and I make sure that we hit those. He likes to tell a story about when we were in Key West for an anniversary trip. He says that we walked around a graveyard for hours in 100-degree heat. I mean, it was in the 90s. It took a little while, but I mean, worth it. And then, of course, we had to go by and see the Tennessee Williams house that's there, and it's privately owned, so you can't tour it. So we drove by in the car, and he, wonderful man, circled the block several times so I could hang out the window and take pictures of these people's home. We, of course, went to the Hemingway house and various other places, and my children are screaming in the background. But so everywhere we go, I try to find our literary sites. Time out. And when you go on your literary pilgrimage, best to leave children at home. So that's one of the places we've gone on literary pilgrimage. And we did not go there for the literary pilgrimage. We went because I am originally from South Florida, from Naples. And we had been down there to visit, and then we just popped down to the Keys for a few days, celebrate our anniversary. And I didn't realize at the time, but I was actually pregnant with my daughter. So now when my husband complains about walking around in the heat, I inform him that at least he didn't do it pregnant. So literary pilgrimages are something that I love to do. I have, where I live is near Flat Rock, North Carolina, where Carl Sandburg's house is, which is just a beautiful place to go. I probably mentioned it before. The Thomas Wolfe House is also in Asheville. There's some Fitzgerald sites there, I think I've mentioned. And then most recently, I took a group of students on a field trip, and we drove to Milledgeville, Georgia, and went to Flannery O'Connor's farm. And I just love me some Flannery O'Connor. We're going to read some of her work on here too. Yeah, I love a good literary pilgrimage. But so there's a book I want to recommend if you're someone as well. I use it as a checklist because this is how I roll. There's a great book. It's called Novel Destinations, and I just love it. I follow them on Instagram too. These are my people. And I knew that this was going to be good because when I started reading it, and this was gifted to me by someone wonderful. When I started reading it, the foreword, there is a reference to The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner in the second sentence of the foreword. And I thought, yes, because I love me some William Faulkner. But this book is great, and it has literary pilgrimage destinations all over the world, organized in various ways. And so let's see if I can find a good page to show you. Literary houses on the prairie, some Mark Twain. So, for example, Edith Wharton, one of our great American female writers, there's a list of places you can go to visit if you're a Edith Wharton fan, or if you find yourself in the Northeast, in the North Atlantic. So anyhow, it's a great book. It's a great way to check off and see where you've been and where you would like to go, and life goals to check off as many of these as possible. I probably have to start traveling now and just constantly travel to see all of it, but that's not going to stop me from trying. So highly recommended novel destinations. And if you're going to travel somewhere and you're curious if there's literary pilgrimage spots, you can Google it, of course, but you can also just ask me. There's a Southern Literary Trail that you can do if you're in the American South. That'll take you through the homes and important places for a lot of Southern writers as well. Eatonton, Georgia is a great place to go. Alice Walker was born there. Anyway, there's a lot to see. And I love visiting those spots. There's just, I don't know, it's inspiring to me. Okay, got some chai tea going in here today. It's really hot. You might see some of the smoke coming up because I just brewed it right before we started. It's a little too hot to sip, but I'll have that going as we talk. All right, so let's talk through the end of Lord of the Flies, and then we'll introduce our next book and finish with a poem, as always, because we all need a little more poetry in our lives. So when we left off in Heart of Darkness, oh my gosh, we had just had this astounding scene with Simon and the Lord of the Flies, which we talked about last time. If you've been reading along with us and you have finished this book, I should probably apologize in advance. It's such a devastating book. The deaths that occur are, I mean, I don't know, they hurt me to the core. I think that Golding does a great job creating characters who we love or have an affinity toward, or who we can see as vulnerable or innocent. And then their deaths, of course, are representative of the deaths of innocence and wisdom and all these things, which we'll talk about. But it also it hurts. It's like a sucker punch. So nice job there, William Golding. All right, so let's start with chapter 9, A View to a Death. And so here we have Simon once again. Back to him. Gosh, these things that happen are so awful. I almost don't want to talk about them, but we must. So I guess I would start, actually. Let's start on page 149, which is a couple pages into this particular chapter, chapter 9. And this is where the party's going on, the eating party. And now at this point, we have a clear differentiation between Ralph, Piggy, and Sam and Eric, and Jack's tribe. And then Simon sort of his own little thing going on out there in the woods. So on 149 is where the meat is all brought out, and that's it's used as a sort of temptation to come. Let's see. Okay, so Piggy and Ralph came to the edge of the grassy platform, and the boys, as they noticed them, fell silent one by one till only the boy next to Jack was talking. Then the silence intruded even there, and Jack turned where he sat. For a time he looked at them, and the crackle of the fire was the loudest noise over the droning of the reef. I love that moment, like that quiet and then the fire crackle, because it's an important moment. Ralph looked away, and Sam, thinking that Ralph had turned to him accusingly, put down his gnawed bone with a nervous giggle. Ralph took an uncertain step, pointed to a palm tree, and whispered something inaudible to Piggy, and they both giggled like Sam. Lifting his feet high out of the sand, Ralph started to stroll past. Piggy tried to whistle. At this moment, the boys who were cooking at the fire suddenly hauled off a great chunk of meat and ran with it toward the grass. They bumped Piggy, who was burnt, and yelled and danced. Immediately, Ralph and the crowd of boys were united and relieved by a storm of laughter. Piggy once more was the center of social derision, so that everyone felt cheerful and normal. It's such an interesting word choice there, that when Piggy becomes this person that they can taunt again, it's what unifies them. And Golding uses the words that everyone felt cheerful and normal. And I'm intrigued by the word normal and what that word means. Hold on, my child's asking for something. Yes?
Sting, but I don't think they sting.
Some big bees sting and some big bees don't. It just depends on the kind of bee. So you need to ask Mom, okay? All right, go ahead. See, important lessons to know if you're ever stuck in the wilderness. Raise them right. So the word normal I find very intriguing, because what is normal? It's a subjective word. I mean, there's a literary definition, there's a denotation, but what does it mean? And in this context, I really hope it's not normal for people to treat someone this way, or it's not normal for people to gather together and mock and deride someone. But on this island, it is. This is the normal. And so it brings everyone cheer, like gladness, and it makes them all feel normal to be doing this to Piggy. So he's sort of sacrificial in that way. And it's intriguing because in these chapters as well, we see Ralph and crew struggling to maintain their civilized way. I was texting with someone, Jessica, who watches this, and she made a fantastic point I hadn't even thought about Ralph, I'm talking about Ralph, about Ralph's hair and how it gets longer and longer and starts irritating him, and it's always in his face and he's always trying to move it out of his face, and at one point it's described as being like the creepers. And so that's certainly meaningful in terms of Ralph's struggle to maintain civility. I mean, I love a good long hair, don't get me wrong, but it's not hair by his choice. It's what the situation is on the island, and for many people in quarantine right now. And so that long hair, like left to its natural ways, shows this overcoming of him, and the description of it attached to the creepers, which is this wild thing. And creepers, of course, are, they wrap up and they entrap and they suffocate and they hold. And this is what's happening to Ralph. I think the first time you read this book, as you're reading through, you're just terrified about what's going to happen with Ralph. Like, is he going to succumb to this? What's the message of that? But over on 152 is where this terrible thing happens with Simon. And of course, all the boys are chanting there, "Kill the beast, cut its throat, spill its blood," which is just a horrific image. But here, Simon comes running in, and the little ones are screaming, and this little one runs in and says, "Him, him." And it says that the thing was crawling out of the forest. It came darkly, uncertainly. The shrill screaming that rose before the beast was like a pain. The beast stumbled into the horseshoe. Kill the beast, cut its throat, spill its blood. The blue-white scar was constant, the noise unendurable. Simon was crying out something about a dead man on a hill. I remember Simon has just had this whole physical experience too. He's in a weakened bodily state. And then he sees the man in the parachute, realizes that it's just a man, it's not a beast. And he's come down to tell them that there is no literal beast, right? Remember, the head told him that the beast was within, right? Imagine thinking the beast was something you could kill. And so here he is to give that message, to say, you guys, there's no beast. Like, it's a man. The beast is man. It's inside of us. And he comes crawling out of the jungle, which is intriguing because that's sort of animalistic, but also he has this, the physical malady that's weakened him in this moment. And so they all, and they attack Simon. And so, and it's just so sad. Even in the rain, they could see how small a beast it was, and already its blood was staining the sand. And Simon has always been this sort of vulnerable, innocent figure, and here he is. He's not the beast, right? The beast is this big scary thing, and he's not the beast, right? He comes crawling out of there. This is little Simon, already broken, right? And they attack him, and you can see this various ways. Certainly Simon is there as representative of something very philosophical, and he owns this message about man and the darkness and the beast inside men, and it's their killing of him, which is a rejection of that idea, or an unwillingness to see it, an unwillingness to accept it. So he is, in many ways, Simon is a messenger who's sacrificed, and whose message is silence. There's a lot about silencing here at the end. We'll get to that too with a conch. But so you can see Simon that way. There's been a lot of imagery with him to suggest him as sort of a Christ figure, a messianic figure. And here he comes with this message, which is not one of salvation necessarily, right? I mean, sure, there's no beast, but it's not good news that the beast is within, but it is something that has to be recognized in order for anything to change. And yet he is immediately killed and sacrificed, like these pigs that are all over the island. There's a whole lot to say about the pigs that I won't have time to go into. But he is he's killed very similarly. He's crawling on the ground. They go after him with the spears. They circle up around him. And then when his body is on the beach, the wind blows and the parachute fills and moves, and that figure that they thought was the beast rises up to its feet, spins, sways down through the vastness of wet air, and trod with ungainly feet the tops of the high trees, still falling. It sank toward the beach, and the boys rushed screaming into the darkness, right? So here comes the beast. The parachute took the figure forward, furrowing the lagoon, and bumped it over the reef and out to sea, right? And this is what happens to Simon's body too. The sea takes it. The sea takes it away. So you have the actual beast coming down, right? The symbol of fear and everything else, and it leaves as well with the beach, because it is also one way to think of it anyway is that it's also evidence of the darkness of man. Remember, because it's a soldier and there's the war and everything else, and it's taken away, and Simon's taken away, and there goes any symbol of man's darkness that perhaps these boys could see, because they're not seeing it within themselves. But the beauty of the scene where Simon's body is taken out to sea is really lovely, when the phosphorescent creatures all come to him, and it's a very peaceful description, right? I mean, he's bleeding on the beach, and it's horrifying. And then all the phosphorescence comes, and the clear water mirrors the clear sky and the angular bright constellations. And then the phosphorescent creatures come around and basically carry him out to sea. And in so doing, his body becomes lit, like lighted up with silver, and his shoulders become marble, and the creatures have vapors, and they lift the body from the sand, right? And then he goes out into the water, and it's just so lovely. Softly surrounded by a fringe of inquisitive bright creatures, itself a silver shape beneath the steadfast constellations, Simon's dead body moved out toward the open sea. So he too is taken by the sea. And there's a lot of this, right? Because in the beginning, it was the beast from the sea that everyone was afraid of, right? This big squid's going to come out and he's going to attack us, right? And in the end, the sea is this lovely thing that comes in and takes Simon out to it, into the beauty and this light. It's a fitting image. It also has a small suggestion of like a funereal pyre, because they're described as having fiery eyes, and he's all lit up, which is also indicative of someone who is, revered in some way. And so, so you have the sort of funeral pyre imagery as he goes out into the sea. So that's very lovely, and it's devastating when Simon dies, and you realize that really, if you think of him as this symbol of the philosophical or introspection, there's an innocence, a vulnerability, right? And all of that is murdered by these boys. And Ralph was very troubled by it, as are Sam and Eric. Piggy wasn't in on it, but they're like, we didn't do anything. It wasn't us, right? It couldn't have been us. We were outside the ring. And at one point, I can't remember if it's Sam or Eric, I don't even know if it differentiates, like touches a gash that's on his head, because he certainly was involved in this. And then he quickly moves it away. But it goes to show that even these boys, who are the ones who are trying to hold on to some vestige of civilization, they're pulled into this. They're pulled into it. There's no fight in them. There's no fighting it. And they are also complicit in Simon's death, right? So it's not just a damnation of the savages, but also these boys, who are more savage than they would like to admit, have given over so much to that. Now, in terms of the rest, the shell and the glasses, it's just not good news at the end of this. On 156 is where Piggy says, you should call an assembly. You're still chief, and Piggy's, I have the conch. I have the conch. And it's this desperation to hold on to the conch as this symbol of voice and power, control even. And a desire to keep on to that. And then, of course, the glasses too, which are symbolic of, wisdom or reason. Anyway, I think wisdom's the wrong word. I've been using the wrong one. Reason is a much better word for this. I'm not sure he's old enough to have that kind of wisdom, but reason certainly. And both of those are under attack at the end of this novel. So if we look over on page, let's see, well, it's we lose the glasses when the boys come to steal it, and they want it for the fire. They don't want it for any kind of reason or to see things more clearly. They want it for fire, but also not fire to be rescued, just fire to cook their meat from the animals that they've slaughtered. So there's that sort of handoff from the glasses as symbolic of reason and civilization with fire, and then being taken for this other use as well. And Piggy keeps saying then that he's blind, and there's a real change in Piggy when he loses his glasses, right? And remember, he was only had one lens going at this point anyway, but there's such a change in him. It's so sad. He has to be led everywhere, right? Piggy is one who really had a voice and he had ideas, but they were never attended to. And so here, at one point, he even says, when they're going to the Castle Rock, I don't need a spear. What's the point? I'm going to have to be led like a dog anyway, which is just so sad, right? And Piggy already struggles with self-image, and people already deride him and put him down. And then that statement is just heartbreaking. And then when they're at the Castle Rock and he's cowering and he's hiding, and at one point he's clinging to this rock, which is ironic, but he becomes so much more vulnerable without them. But it also symbolizes for us the complete loss of reason on this island, and not just the loss of it, but the snatching of it away, right? That there not only is just no room for reason, but there's no respect for reason either. So between that and then the smashing of the conch as well, the elements of civilization that were holding this group together are destroyed. So on that happy note, let's look at a couple of these scenes. I would also point out that on this day, that the weather is really important in these final chapters with the thunder and the lightning and all of that too. So I should have pointed that out before. Let's see. On 170. Just an ordinary fire. You'd think we could do that, wouldn't you? Just a smoke signal so we can be rescued. Are we savages or what? Only now there's no signal going up. Ships may be passing. Do you remember how he went hunting and the fire went out and a ship passed by? And they all think he's best as chief. Then there was, that's his fault too. If it hadn't been for him, it would never have happened, referring to Simon. Now Piggy can't see, and they came stealing. Ralph's voice ran up. At night, in darkness, and stole our fire. They stole it. We'd have given them fire if they'd asked, but they stole it, and the signal's out, and we can't ever be rescued. Don't you see what I mean? We'd have given them fire for themselves, only they stole it. And then Piggy holds out his hands for the conch, right? But there's a lot in here in terms of Ralph and Ralph's character development, right? His hanging on to this fire, the threat he feels with Jack as chief. The thing that happened to Simon, that was all Jack's fault, right? He's certainly the ringleader, don't get me wrong, but they all had a hand in that. We would have given them the fire. Would you have given him the fire? We will never know, right? And he's on and on about them stealing the fire, right? Which is also, them taking any of the civilized ways back. And they decide when they're going to go to that castle, they're going to go, Ralph says, we should comb our hair and we should look like we looked when we first came here, right? So it's this final attempt to restore civilization here, right? We're not going to go all painted up like savages. We're going to go with our hair combed, and then Sam and Eric, sorry about that, says something about how, we have socks, we can put them on our heads like hats if our hair's too crazy, right? They're trying to make themselves look civilized for this final confrontation between civilization and savagery. At least that's how they see it. But they don't realize how much of that, savagery has already come within them. and that they're struggling so hard at this point to keep it away. Okay, we can't avoid it forever. All right, so the death of Piggy. Okay, so if we have the death of Simon, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I keep bumping the table. And the death of Simon, you know, we know that Simon has all of this imagery associated with him, and he is killed by the stabbing and all of that. And Piggy also represents reason and all these things. There's something to be said for the way that Piggy dies as well. Piggy dies by stoning, right? As soon as he stands up and tries to speak, stones start hitting him, right? There's a sort of small stoning. And then he is finally killed by the boulder. And it's horribly graphic, right? But symbolic, right? So you've got the stoning, which once again evokes this sort of religious or spiritual event. But also when Piggy dies, remember that his head breaks open and his brains come out, right? And he is, you know, reason. So he loses the ability to see, and then he loses the ability to reason. And the fact that it's a stoning, I don't know that necessarily means there's some kind of religious message or significance, but certainly he's stoned because he's finally standing up for himself, and he's standing up to speak. And there is something to be said for that, and for the fact that natural objects are used to kill him. There's a lot of that here. And I would point out that it's not nature actually that ends up attacking them, right? It's them using nature as their tool, right? They get the rocks, right? The rocks don't just fall on them, right? No one's killed that way. And so, so Piggy's death is very meaningful in that way. It's tragic. It's just devastating. And, you know, right before he does, he holds up the conch, and I got the conch, I've got the conch, which is what he's been saying this whole time. And when the rock hits Piggy, it also shatters the conch, which is, you know, also a symbol of power and voice. And so everything that's wrapped up symbolically in the conch and in Piggy are all lost in this one moment, this stoning. And Piggy's described as Piggy's arms and legs twitched a bit like a pig's after it's been killed, right? And that's what they're doing. You've got these scenes of them hunting these pigs and killing these wild animals, but that's exactly how they're treating their fellow humans as well. That's important. And that's when they go after Ralph as well. Now, the thing about Ralph and what happens with him, we're getting to it now, kids. Oh gosh, where to even begin? Ralph goes and he sees the Lord of the Flies. And I would also point out that it seems like a throwaway line when Sam and Eric tell Ralph that Roger has a stick that's pointed at both ends to come hunt Ralph. But you have to think for a second, why would you need a stick pointed at both ends? Like you're going to pull like a Jedi double-ended lightsaber, Darth Maul, like, choo, choo. Well, no, the suggestion is that Ralph's head will soon be on a pike, right? One end to dig into the ground, one end to impale something on top, so that Jack too will be slaughtered like these pigs, decapitated, and his head put up on a stick. There's a lot in this book that reminds me of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I love this book. And that's another one that you read in high school, and oftentimes it's so poorly done because it's a slower paced book, but that's intentional. And I read that book in high school and I just hated it. Like if you told me, like, what were the books that you read in high school that you just couldn't stand? There's one, and it was Heart of Darkness. I read it again as an adult, and my golly, is that a good book. There are many parallels that you see here in Golding's work, and a very similar theme as well about the darkness of man. I mean, you can tell from the title, Heart of Darkness. It's about, once we get past the civilized veneer, what's really inside there? What is human capacity for evil? and for darkness, and what strength do we have against it? But anyway, and then Jack sees the skull and crushes it as well. And yet, even when he crushes it, it's still smiling at him. And he gets the stick and holds it as a spear between him and the skull. And then he backs away from it. He never turns his back on that skull, right? And, you can interpret this scene many different ways, and many ways incorrectly, to be fair. But it's in a clearing. He's looking at the skull. And he questions its lifelessness because it's laughing at him cynically, right? And perhaps it's this whole laughter once again, which she thought the beast was something you could kill, right? It's in you. And Ralph destroys it, breaks it, right? With the very pike on which it hangs. All right, so let's get to the end here. We got to wrap this baby up. Okay, so intriguing that they decide to smoke him out of the forest. So they're going to light it on fire and smoke him out. And it goes to show there's so much irony in here. First of all, that they will destroy this place to get him out. Like, what are they thinking, right? But secondly, that this whole time we've been talking about the fire to keep the fire going. And the people at the castle don't seem to care two whits about there being a signal fire, right? Ironic that the fire that they're using to finally destroy this last enemy, this symbol, this threat of their way of life, is the very fire that brings them rescue, right? So you've got their irony in that. But even more so in terms of irony, and of course they're chasing him at the end like the pig and everything else, and Ralph is defending himself and he's starting to fight, right? And he's stabbing at people out of his own sense of self-preservation. But at the very end, when the British officer shows up, the naval officer, the boys all come, and there's little Percival, who can't remember his name. And names are something that differentiate us and are attached to our character and all these other things. Your name is central to your identity, and it's like he's lost his because he can't remember his name. He doesn't remember who he is. And the officer says to them, they talk about the boys who are killed very superficially. And you don't know how many of you there are. No, sir, says Ralph. I should have thought that a pack of British boys, you're all British, aren't you, would have been able to pull up a better show than that. I mean, it was like that at first, Sir Ralph, before we were together then. I know, jolly good show, like the Coral Island. And the officer as well has been, oh, look, you're here, playing a game, playing war, playing fighting, like it's just being child's play on this beach. He's underestimating them, as we often do with children, and the depth of them. And then Ralph bursts into tears. And it says that he cries for the first time on the island, great shuddering spasms of grief that seemed to wrench his whole body. His voice rose under the black smoke before the burning wreckage of the island. And affected by that emotion, the other little boys began to shake and sob too. And in the middle of them, with filthy body, matted hair, and unwiped nose, Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true, wise friend called Piggy. And then the officer is embarrassed and turns away. Now, the ending of this book is important and frustrates a lot of people. Because all of a sudden, like, here this guy comes in, and then he takes them up, and they all get away. And you're like, it's really abrupt. Like, we're like murdering people, and we're chasing Ralph through the woods, and then the end. Think of it this way. We talked about how this is set during wartime. And we talked a little bit about this idea that, the very adults that they want to save them are in the midst of this savage battle, because war is violent and devastating. And so here, he underestimates these boys, these little innocent little children, who have had a war of their own here. That's very much sort of this microcosm of what's going on in the world. And so here, Ralph, the adult also underestimates the profound level of thought within this child and that life and experience gives to people. because Ralph is weeping for the end of innocence because it's gone. You can see it embodied perhaps in Simon or Piggy, but it will never be the same. There are things that have happened and been seen that cannot be unseen. There are actions that have been taken that cannot be undone. He wept for the darkness of man's heart because he has the recognition of that. He's seen it, not just in the savages, but in himself. And he weeps for the fall through the air of the true wise spring called Piggy. I remember those two chapters, beast from water, beast from air, right? And you've got Simon who gets carried out to sea, and then Piggy who falls through the air as well, right? The beast does come in both those places and destroys. And he realizes now that Piggy was a true friend, right? That, you know, he took for granted quite a bit. But here's where we get some thematic irony. The officer surrounded by these noises was moved and a little embarrassed, right? He's embarrassed by emotion, which is it's a human thing, emotion. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together. So he turns his back on them after he's come, and he's like, oh, how are you guys? Just playing your little game? Then he realizes there's so much more going on. And he turns his back on it and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance. What's really devastating about the end of this book is that this is a man of war who has appeared. He's saving these kids from the island, but he's taking them back to a world at war, to a world of violence and murder. And he is taking them there on a warship. So this is part of Ralph's lamentation too, that they might be leaving this savage island behind, but they are going back to an equally savage world. The end. Wah, wah. Couple things I wanted to point out, just sort of thematically. You can certainly, there's a lot that's written on the Lord of the Flies, the image with the pig, as related to the Freudian id. So this idea, you know, that the ego, that we all put on these sort of facades, and a lot of that is in our societal structures and the way we behave and our mores. But really within, there's something that's very complex underneath this veneer. And so that perhaps the Lord of the Flies represents the veneer stripped away, right? And then what's there. The other thing I wanted to mention was a quote from Heart of Darkness, which I just mentioned. So, because this is interesting. At the end of the scene with the Lord of the Flies, Simon imagines he's looking into this black mouth. There was blackness within, a blackness that spread. Simon was inside the mouth. He fell down and lost consciousness. There's a quote in Heart of Darkness. I saw the dying Kurtz open his mouth wide. It gave him a weirdly voracious aspect, as though he wanted to swallow all the air, all the earth, all the men before him. It's interesting, the combination between the two. So I will say that reading the book through this time, it meant more to me than when I first read it. Oh gosh, I must have been in high school. And I do think it's appropriate right now in the world that we're living in, the society that we're living in, with a lot of the conflict that's going on around the world, but also within our own country. I see a lot of images of questionable civility on the news, and what do we do about that? What do we decide? Do we let it take over? Is that just part of who we are? Have we pulled back the veneer on ourselves, and are we really seeing human nature now? That's terrifying. And what do we do about it? That's the question to leave you with. I did want to point out a couple things about the cover, because I think it's just great. It ties into what Jessica had been saying about the hair as well, how it's all tied into the creepers, but also the fact that this is on the top of the head, so the mind as well, that it's taking over. And then you've got the flies representative of death on here too. And then on the back of mine, there's another one with the war paint, and you've got the blue eyes, which Jack's described as having, which are often associated with innocence or clarity, but looking around the branches that are coming there. It's interesting because at least this one on the back, it's hard for you to see, but it's so brightly colored, like the nature is so verdant and green and refreshing, and similarly on the front too. and yet so much darkness happens within. All right, so leave questions or comments. If you have a different reading of something, I would love to hear it. I always want to keep learning. And if you have other questions or things I didn't answer or that you just want to bring up, then leave questions in the comments and I will make a video, like a sort of supplementary, to go back and answer them for you. Also, I posted on my Facebook page a link to an article about Lord of the Flies that I think is really intriguing to put into the historical context in which he was writing this book. Spoiler alert, it has a lot to do with war, but so take a look at that, and I think it might, a little author biographical context might illuminate the work for you a little bit more. All right, our next book is going to be mine. This is a complete tone shift, and I think we need it after Lord of the Flies. So this is my novel, Sweet Divinity. We're going to read it next. I've already mentioned you can order it on Amazon. You can get it as an ebook on Amazon as well, or Barnes & Noble, or you can order directly from my publisher, Perspective Press, and I'd encourage you to do that just to help that small press stay afloat in these difficult financial times. And if you're local to me, I can always drop one off, or you can also purchase it at M. Judson Booksellers in Greenville, South Carolina. So what we'll do is let's read chapters 1 through 5 for next weekend. And what I would really love is if you would submit some questions to me in advance so I know what to talk about. So I'll put a post a little bit later in the week asking for some questions. But I'll tell you a little bit then about how I was inspired to write the book and sort of what the process was, and then we'll talk about it a little bit too. So chapters 1 through 5 of Sweet Divinity for next week. And then I have some other ideas of books that we're going to read coming up, but keep them coming, please, because I want to read what you want to read. That's how we're going to learn best, if we're enjoying it together. All right, I'm going to finish today with a poem. This one is by Stephen Crane. He's an American poet. He was a post-Civil War poet. We really know him more probably for his fiction. So The Open Boat is a very famous short story by Stephen Crane, beautifully written. He also was a journalist, and he wrote a book called Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, which was based on his experience living amongst the low classes in New York City. Anyway, so his writing is very journalistic. It comes across that way. But he has a poem called War is Kind, and I thought that was a good one to finish up our discussion with Lord of the Rings. Do not weep, maiden, for war is kind, because your lover threw wild hands toward the sky and the affrighted steed ran on alone. Do not weep. War is kind. Hoarse, booming drums of the regiment, little souls who thirst for fight. These men were born to drill and die. The unexpected glory flies above them. Great is the battle god, great in his kingdom, a field where 1,000 corpses lie. Do not weep, babe, for war is kind, because your father tumbled in the yellow trenches, raged at his breast, gulped and died. Do not weep. War is kind. Swift blazing flag of the regiment, eagle with crest of red and gold. These men were born to drill and die. Point for them the virtue of slaughter. Make plain to them the excellence of killing, and a field where 1,000 corpses lie. Mother whose heart hung humble as a button on the bright splendid shroud of your son. Do not weep. War is kind. So you need to look at it. Poem alternates stanza structures. So you have these war is kind, which is sort of the messaging, and then these stanzas in between, which are more of the vivid reality of war, right? And so he in many of his works, you would also know him for writing The Red Badge of Courage. In many of his works, he examines the concept that there's something glorious in war. It's a very similar concept to what Hemingway explores in his works, but Crane does as well. And he is very interested in the ways that people depict and view war. And so you see that in this book, this poem. But I think it's an appropriate one for Lord of the Flies because you have the war on the island, but also the grander, I don't know, grander is not the word, the greater war that's going on as well. And then of course the internal war that we all face at some point. All right, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed our study of Lord of the Flies, and I hope you'll read Sweet Divinity with us. After Sweet Divinity, we'll read something else that's, I got a couple in mind. I'm not sure which one to do, but something that is a little more, you know, classic, I suppose. Just kind of want to make sure that we have a nice variety. We're going to read some short stories at some point too. So I will see you soon. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend, and I hope the work week is good to you. Thanks, guys.